This unit's going to be on the nervous system, and it's loads of fun. There is some overlap because we already looked at a neuromuscular junction. We looked at the impulse coming down, the neuron opening up the voltage-gated calcium channels, letting calcium in, blah, blah, blah. Impulses get conducted down neurons very similar to they get conducted down muscles. So a lot of that's going to be overlap. So if you got it the first time, you'll see some things that are similar and it'll be easier for you to grasp. If you didn't get it the first time, then you get to get beat up on it again. All right, so let's see what we got. So nervous system subdivisions. Anatomically, they break the nervous system down into two parts. Anybody know what those parts are? You've probably heard of them. If I said the brain and the spinal cord are part of what nervous system? Yeah, central nervous system. So we got a central, then we got a peripheral. Okay, so the central nervous system, and I just mentioned that's brain and spinal cord, are the, let's see, we didn't quite make them. Sorry, she got a little slacked a little bit. So, made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay. Then the peripheral nervous system are the spinal nerves that come out between those holes. And then they got them, yeah. Go right here. Come out between those holes between the bones. Two vertebrae came together and they made little holes that came out the side. What were those called? Intervertebral foramen, and that's where the peripheral nerves come out. Okay? And nerves are a bundle of neurons wrapped in connective tissue, and they'll categorize them as two different types. Cranial nerves, nerves that come off the brain or brain stem, and spinal nerves, nerves that come off the spinal cord. All right. Another thing that we'll see, it's not really part of the, it's part of the peripheral nervous system, are called ganglion, or ganglia. These are neuron cell bodies. So where the nucleus is part of the cell body of the neuron, and where we find groups of these cell bodies, we call them ganglia. And we haven't really totally looked at what a neuron looks like. Sure. But where we find these cell bodies clustered together, they'll often call them ganglia. All right. So here we get a little full frontal nudity. Wake us up in the morning. We got the brain and the spinal cord. That's the central nervous system. So brain, spinal cord, central nervous system, everything else that comes off, part of the peripheral nervous system. Functional divisions of the peripheral nervous system. So now we're taking just the peripheral nervous system and we're breaking it down into sensory and motor. The other term they use is efferent and afferent. Okay, I think we used efferent before in the last unit, so it should sound somewhat familiar. But the first one's the afferent division. It's also the sensory division. Depending on what book you might use as a reference, they might use one of these terms more than the other. Okay, so you should be familiar with both. And this means the information is being carried generally from a receptor to the central nervous system, or to the brain and the spinal cord. Okay? So afferent carries it to the central nervous system. That means efferent is going to carry it from the central nervous system outward. Okay? So we have what's called a visceral sensory division. Viscera tends to mean like an organ. Okay, so information being carried to the central nervous system from our viscera, from our abdominal or thoracic cavities, from our internal organs. Okay, and that's different than our somatic sensory division, where those receptors are in the skin, generally, and these receptors are to pick up information about the outside world. So visceral is sensory information from inside our body. Somatic sensory information from the outside world picked up on receptors generally in the skin. Okay, is something hot? Is something sharp? Is something dull? Is it cold? Is it wet? Information about things outside our body. Okay, does that make sense for us? Then we have the efferent division, sometimes referred to as the motor division. And this is carrying information from the central nervous system to something, telling it to do something. Okay, that's why they call it motor. So it conveys the impulses away from the central nervous system. Usually the thing they carry it to, they'll refer to it as the effector. That's why they named it the efferent. The efferent sends information to the effector. In the neuromuscular junction, the effector was the what? Skeletal muscle. Okay, the neuron was telling the skeletal muscle what to do. Okay. Visceral motor division would be telling things inside our body what to do, okay, that aren't skeletal muscle. The visceral motor division is our autonomic nervous system, okay? Autonomic's the word. You can almost think of it as automatic. These are the things that happen inside the body that you don't have conscious control over, okay? The body takes care of them on their own. So their effectors won't be skeletal muscle because most of us knew skeletal muscle was voluntary. It's going to be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glands, things that most of us, like on the test, knew were involuntary. Okay? This part of the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, controls that. And there's two divisions to the autonomic nervous system. There's a sympathetic division and a parasympathetic division, and we'll learn the differences between the two. Okay? You heard of parasympathetic and sympathetic before? No? Okay, so this will be brand new. Autonomic nervous system. And the two parts that make up the autonomic nervous system are the sympathetic, parasympathetic. So the next picture is the flow chart. I think you guys had a picture of that somewhere, maybe. No? Okay, cool, on the front page. So we got a somatic motor division, which is now not the inside of the body, okay, not the involuntary things. These are more things that affect us in the outside world, but it's our skeletal muscle. It's our voluntary structure. So when we talked about the synaptic knobs synapsing on the skeletal muscle, that neuron was a somatic motor or a somatic efferent neuron. I think we mentioned that. Okay? And it's telling the skeletal muscle to do. And you guys have control over skeletal muscle, right? It's voluntary. That's the somatic. It's not the autonomic nervous system. So here's a flow chart, kind of what this looks like. Here, we've got the central nervous system. We break it down in just the brain and the spinal cord. Very simple. The peripheral nervous system, we have a sensory division and a motor division. The sensory could also be called the what division? Afferent, okay, or afferent. And the motor division was the efferent, okay? The sensory division gets broken down into visceral and somatic. Visceral, sensory from inside the body, abdominal cavity, thoracic cavity. Somatic from receptors in the skin. Good. Motor division, we got a somatic motor division. This is going to be the ones telling the skeletal muscle what to do. Voluntary, we have control of it. And then we have everything else, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, that we don't voluntarily have control over. That falls under our visceral motor division, which is, you could write right in there, A and S. And the two divisions of the A and S, or autonomic nervous system, is the sympathetic, parasympathetic divisions. Okay. Any questions on that so far? We're just kind of putting them in categories. Neurons by function. We got about 1 trillion neurons in the nervous system. To give you an idea, if you were out on a clear night, maybe in Flagstaff, where there's not a lot of ambient light, and you looked at all the stars in the sky, 1 trillion would be about 10 times what you see in the sky. Okay, or maybe about what we owe China. I'm not sure. So it's a lot. Anymore, they throw millions and billions and trillions, and it just, you don't even think about it. It's a lot. Okay, so sensory afferent neurons. Their receptors are going to be in the skin or inside the body? Inside the body. Could be in the skin, because we didn't say whether or not these were somatic or visceral. So sensory have receptors that are going to pick up on changes. Okay, they could be inside the body, they could be outside the body if we don't designate visceral or somatic. this information gets taken away. So I'm trying to help you remember it by putting the afferent and then away. They're both in yellow, so you see that they both start with A. This information is taken away from the receptor to the central nervous system. Okay. So this is a sensory neuron. An afferent neuron is one type of neuron if we classify them by their function. Another type of neuron that we haven't heard of yet is called an interneuron. Sometimes some books call them association neurons. These neurons lie between the sensory and motor pathways. Interneurons are always found in the CNS. So they're always found in the central nervous system. And it's said that they process, store, and retrieve information. So essentially what they do is they integrate all the information that the body has, the information that's coming in, the information that's been stored, and it helps the central nervous system figure out what it's going to do about something. Okay? Does that make sense? Hope so. About 90% of all the neurons in the body are interneurons. They're in the central nervous system. Okay? And then the last by function were the motor, the efferent neurons. They send signals out to muscles and glands. Notice because we didn't say somatic or visceral, I can throw muscles out there because they could go to skeletal, cardiac, smooth, any of the three, and gland cells. And then these effectors react to what the neuron tells it to do. They respond. This is where that stimulation would come. So, looks like everybody's caught up. Here's just another picture showing you kind of by location. We've got the sensory neurons here. So this line, this divider, is basically saying these are peripheral nervous system. This is central nervous system. So the sensory neurons are in the peripheral nervous system, and they move back into the central nervous system where they synapse on these interneurons. The interneurons process the information, they integrate it, and then if they fire, they tell the motor neuron to go ahead and do its thing, and it sends a signal back out into the peripheral nervous system to its effector. In this case, it looks like it's skeletal muscle, telling the skeletal muscle what to do. Okay. All right, so the autonomic nervous system is also referred to as the what division? Visceral efferent. Yep. Number 3. All right, good. All right, now we're going to get into some properties of neurons. We had properties of muscle. Okay. Some of these are the same. All right, so once again, if you knew them for muscle, you can just remember them for the neuron. All right. So properties of neuron. A neuron can be excitable. It can be stimulated. It has irritability. It has ability to respond to changes. Okay. So responds to changes in the body and the external environment, we call those changes stimuli. Okay? Muscle had that same, responded to stimuli. Okay? When a muscle responded with a stimulation, it had a change in polarity across its membrane, and then it did what with that change? Well, you got an action potential, good, and it did the action potential spread. Okay, so we could say it conducted it, right? It transferred it to each end. Neurons do the same thing. Okay? It's conductivity. So it produces these traveling electrical signals that move from one end of the neuron to the other. And since we've seen where they go to those ends, those synaptic knobs. Okay? And then when they got there, what did they cause the synaptic knob to do? Exocytosis of a neurotransmitter. So we know that they can do that. So here the other thing that they do is they can secrete, and they secrete neurotransmitters. The most common, most abundant is acetylcholine. Okay? So we've already kind of seen this in action. So neurons are excitable, they're conductive, they can secrete. So that's the only one that's new. Muscles didn't have the ability to secrete. But those 3 things, that's hopefully fairly simple and very easy to get your mind around because you're familiar with it. Next up is the structure of a neuron. So there's a picture of what a common neuron looks like. This would be called a multipolar neuron. Neurons have a cell body or soma. This is the cell body. Okay? In the cell body or the soma is where we're going to find the nucleus, sometimes a large nucleolus. And then it has little things that come off of it, look like almost like hairs. Those are called dendrites. Okay? If we have a cluster of these somas or these cell bodies in a certain area in the peripheral nervous system, we might find them in what's called a what? Ganglia. Okay? So that's what we were referring to a little bit ago. Okay? So single central nucleus with large nucleolus is found in the cell body. Also in that cell body we have a cytoskeleton. Okay? Gives the neuron cell body a little bit of a shape, so it's not just a gelatinous blob. It also compartmentalizes the rough endoplasmic reticulum into what are called Nissl bodies. That's really, I need to take that out. It's really not that relevant anymore. When we used to look at neurons, you would see these Nissl bodies because they stain darkly on a microscope, but we don't do that anymore. The little hairs coming off the cell body, said were called dendrites. And this is oftentimes where we receive signals. So when something synapses, when another neuron synapses, and when I say that, we know what a synapse is, right? That's what we saw at the neuromuscular junction. A nerve synapsing on a muscle. A nerve can synapse on another nerve. And when it does this, it often does it at the dendrites. Sometimes it does it on the cell body. Okay? Neurons will have a single axon nerve fiber leaving the cell body. Okay? And there's a little transitional area where you look at this and you're kind of like, is this cell body or is it part of the axon? Which is it? Okay? That right there, we're going to call that the axon hillock. And or another word you can use for it is called trigger zone. Okay? So this little transitional area, kind of where is it the initial portion of the axon, we're going to call that the axon hillock or trigger zone. And in this axon hillock, we have a large number of voltage-gated channels located. Okay. Sometimes the axons can have collaterals, which means they can have branches. Not often, but they can. The axon comes to the end, the terminal. The train terminal is the end, where the train ends up. Those are those synaptic knobs. With the neuromuscular junction, sometimes they refer to them as motor end plates. Okay? There's all kinds of different terms they use for those. But those are that's where we saw the synaptic knob forming that synapse. Okay? Now, the cytoplasm within the axon, they're going to call the axoplasm. The membrane of the axon, they're going to call the axolemma. Okay? And then in those synaptic knobs, the other thing we can find are those synaptic vesicles, and they obviously, we remember, hold the neurotransmitter, right? So, with these axons, or these neurons, this cell body is generally very small, okay? So this picture, this is how they'll draw it, this is how they'll show it. This is actually really small, and there's usually lots and lots of dendrites, okay? The other thing is these axons here tend to be very long. So if we took a neuron out, just a regular, kind of what they think of as a normal neuron, and we blew it up, okay? And we made the cell body the size of just a tennis ball, okay? There'd be absolutely nowhere, and we had it in this room, there'd be absolutely nowhere to move. The whole room would be filled up with dendrites, okay? And this axon would probably be about a mile long, okay, to give you an idea. So it's a very long axon, lots and lots of dendrites. Soma cell body is pretty small, okay? Another picture, same thing, cell body, nucleus, dendrites, axon hillock trigger zone, okay? Then we go down the axon, and here are all the synaptic knobs. The little white things we haven't gotten to yet, look like little marshmallows on there that we're going to roast. Those are actually Schwann cells that form what are called myelin sheaths. Okay? We had myelin sheaths in the last unit. It's what helped isolate the neuromuscular junction. So at that synapse, where the synaptic knob didn't touch the muscle, there was one of these Schwann cells that kind of formed a shell over the top so things couldn't leak in and out of that area. So that picture was a multipolar neuron. Multipolar neurons are the most common. Okay? And a multipolar neuron is defined as one axon, many dendrites. A variant to that is we can have a bipolar neuron. A bipolar neuron has an axon or cell body, a soma or cell body, and it has one dendrite come off of it, and it has one axon come off of it. So it has two things coming off of it, and that's why they'll call it a bipolar neuron. One dendrite, one axon. Now that axon might come off of it and then have branches and spread and have many branches to the dendrite, but only one of those is actually coming off the soma or cell body. So if I said we have okay, this is where they find them. They're rare. You can find them in the olfactory, which is the nose, retina in the eye, ear. If I said we have a unipolar neuron, how many branches are coming off that soma or cell body? One, okay? That one branch, so if this was it was a ball here, we'd have a branch come off and it'll split. One area will go and become the dendrites, one will become the axon. Okay, but only one came off of the neuron. Okay? So one branch splits into the axon and the dendrites. We have some of these that get sensory information from the skin and some of our internal organs. Because the multipolar neurons are the most common, the bipolar and the unipolar are fairly uncommon. And then they have what's called an anaxonic neuron. This one just has many dendrites. It doesn't appear to have any axon. They find them in the eyes, and it helps with some of the visual processes. And when we say visual process, kind of sharpening up the contrast so that you can see a little better. So I gave you a visual of a neuron. We blew it up, the soma or cell body the size of a tennis ball, the axon would be a mile long. Some of these originate maybe in your spinal cord, and the neuron will actually go all the way down to your bottom of your foot. Okay, so if you take a 7-foot basketball player who has probably a 38 or 40-inch inseam, you can see that some of these neurons on their own, just in normal real life, could be over a meter long. Here's some pictures of what those variants look like. This is the most common once again. This was the multipolar. Soma, cell body, lots of dendrites, one axon. This is the unipolar. We have one branch coming off of the soma or cell body and it splits. Up here becomes the dendrites. Here's the axon, becomes the synaptic knobs. Here's our bipolar. One end's the dendrites, the other end is the axon, and then the anaxonic. Okay. So now we're moving from some of the general stuff into the spinal cord. And the spinal cord's kind of a connection between the brain and the rest of the body, right? And that spinal cord, is that conducting sensory information? Is it conducting motor information? Is it conducting both? Both, yeah, both. Good. So it's kind of a, this will say information highway, I couldn't remember what term that used, between the brain and the body. It's sending sensory and motor information up and down. Okay? And so it's sending, I could also say it's sending afferent and efferent information. Okay? Some of the functions that the spinal cord does is this conduction, sensory and motor information up and down. It also kind of controls locomotion, which means movement, walking. The spinal cord, where the brain does a lot of the processing of big things that require thought, requires memories, requires all kinds of different things. Simple, repetitive processes like chewing or walking, the spinal cord will kind of handle. Okay? Your brain, you don't have to really think about doing those things. And spinal cord handles reflexes. So whenever there's thinking there's maybe possibly a spinal cord injury, they're always wanting to check reflexes. Okay? Reflexes will be conducted by that spinal cord, and your brain will have a conscious perception of what's going on. When we think of a reflex, what do we think of? The knee-jerk reflex, the patellar reflex at the doctor's office where they get out the little hammer and they hit your knee, and your knee goes like that. And you realize it happened, but it happens just before your brain even processes it, okay? It's a reflex. So, anatomy of the spinal cord. I suppose I should say, how would you define a reflex? If I said that patellar reflex, or you have a reflexive thing you do, how would you describe a reflex to somebody? A what? An automated response. That's good. Okay. It's an involuntary response, isn't it? That knee jerk, you didn't try to kick your knee. Okay. Would you say most reflexes, if you know that person, do you think the doctor knows the person's going to kick their knee when they hit the hammer? So it's predictable. So reflexes tend to be predictable. It's pre-programmed. Okay. It's non-voluntary. So it's a predictable, programmed response to stimuli. Okay, it's involuntary, I think, if I said that. So that would be what we think of reflex. And that can be even a reflex if somebody screams when you scare them. Okay? If you're walking out to your car and it's 11 o'clock at night here and the car lot's empty or whatever, you parked off on one of these side streets and somebody jumps out at you, you can have a pretty good idea how they're going to respond. Okay? Predictable once again. And they're going to scream possibly without really meaning to scream. Yeah. You can override it, but you can't really pre-program. Like say that, we'll go back to the knee-jerk one. That's going to happen unless there's a problem. So they're looking for that. It can be modified. You can block it. Like if I could sit there and you can say, I won't kick my knee. And you can override that reflex. And oftentimes people do because they don't like it. They don't like being hit with the thing in their knee. So they'll give you something to distract you. They'll say, do this or do that. And while you're distracted, they'll do it to see if it kicks. Spinal cord starts at foramen magnum. You guys remember that big hole in the occipital bone, right? And it goes all the way down to L1. All right. Now, is L1 the lowest level of the lumbar spine or the highest level of the lumbar spine? Highest, because we number the spinal segments 1 through 7, 1 through 12, 1 through 4. So this goes down to the top of the lower back. Okay? That's where your spinal cord goes, and that's in an adult. In a child, it'll go down to L3, so it goes down lower. Okay? And this is important because lots and lots of cell bodies, somas, which you can call the neuron brain, are located in that spinal cord. If you damage them, that neuron's dead. It will never work again. Okay? So you don't ever have anything stuck into your actual spinal cord. They stick things into your spinal cavity to get cerebral spinal fluid, and where do they do that at? They do it up in your upper back, or they do it in your lower back? Yeah, towards the sacrum. They do it at like L5. So they do it at that lower level because the spinal cord stopped at L1 in an adult, L3 in a child, and let's just not risk it, we'll go down to L4 or L5. Okay, that way if I stick a needle in there to get cerebral spinal fluid, I'm not putting it into your spinal cord and you lose the ability to control your legs forever. Okay, that would be bad. Okay, so other things about the spinal cord. Between those intervertebral foramen, where the spinal nerves come out, we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, 31 that come off on the right side, 31 that come off on the left side. The spinal cord tends to be a little bit enlarged in the cervical and lumbar areas because you have more spinal nerves coming off in the cervical area and in the lumbar area, because in the cervical area, the spinal nerves are going out all the way down your arms. And in the lumbar area, they're going out down your legs. Okay. The tip of the spinal cord is called the medullary cone. Okay, so the spinal cord comes down, and at L1 it kind of tapers to a tip called the medullary cone. Then you still have nerves or neurons that come off the spinal cord there, and they thought it looked like a horse's tail when they were dissecting these way back in the day, and so they called it the cauda equina. Cauda means tail, equine means horse, so they thought it looked like a horse's tail. And those will still come out. So even though the spinal cord stopped at, say, L1, there's still nerves that come off and come out at L2, at L3, at L4, at L5. Down the sacral canal, they come out those sacral foramina. Okay? But it's not that cone, it's not that spinal cord. That's stopped at the medullary cone at L1. Okay? The difference is it's not a solid mass, so it's a bunch of neurons. Think of almost like hairs running down and running out. So if I push a needle in there, chances are if it hits one of those hairs, it's just going to push it to the left or to the right. Okay? It's not going to damage it. L2 to S5 nerve roots resemble the horse's tail. Okay. Now we saw in bone, we had connective tissue that wrapped around the bone. We called it the periosteum. That was good. We have the connective tissue that wrapped around muscle. We called that the epimysium. Good. Okay. We're going to have connective tissue that wraps around neurons. It's going to wrap around the brain. It's going to wrap around the spinal cord. And we're going to call that the meninges. Okay. Around the brain and the spinal cord, these thicker structures we'll call meninges. There's even smaller connective tissue that wraps around the neurons and whatnot that you'll see. And it'll be very easy because it'll be very much like you saw in muscles. So, meninges have 3 layers. And on this particular unit, we're focusing on the spinal cord. Unit 5 will focus more on the brain. And these meninges are a little different, brain versus spinal cord. So it might point out one of those differences even though we haven't seen the brain, just for future reference. The outermost layer is called the dura mater. You've probably heard of that. Now, in the spinal cord, that dura mater has one layer known as the meningeal layer. Okay? So, you guys have seen a vertebrae. You saw the vertebral foramen, the hole in the center of the bone. Okay? And between that bone and this dura mater, there's space. Okay? And it's filled with fat. Okay? And they call that the epidural space. And that's a place they can do epidural injections to block pain. The fat, we know, is a loose connective tissue. Whatever's injected in there gets absorbed in there very quickly. Okay? The reason I mention this is that when we get to the brain, the dura mater has 2 layers. Okay? And so it has this meningeal layer, and it has another layer with it. So I just want to make you aware that it's a little different in the brain. Second layer is the arachnoid matter. Arachnoid matter has a filamentous layer. It has a lot of filaments that come off into what's called the subarachnoid space. And they thought it looked like spider webs. So arachnophobia, fear of spiders, arachnoid matter, they kind of thought it looked like spider webs. And then the last is the pia mater. This is a very thin layered connective tissue that adheres directly to both the brain and the spinal cord. You really can't hardly get the pia mater off the brain without damaging the brain or the spinal cord. And we have some accessory structures of the pia mater. Okay? So, you have this spinal cord. Started at foramen magnum, goes down to L1. Okay? And obviously we know it's vital. We've encased it in bone. We've put bone all around it to protect it. Now, do we want it banging around in there in the bones like a bell? No. Okay? So if I had something coming out of the ceiling, running down to here, and it stopped, okay, and I didn't want it moving, what could I do to try to anchor it? How about if I ran something off the bottom of it, off that cone, off the medullary cone, and attached it to the floor and pulled that tight? Would that do that? Okay. We have that. We have an accessory structure of the pia mater known as phylum terminale. Okay. It comes off the medullary cone. It goes down through the sacral canal, out the little portion at the bottom of the sacrum, that little hole. What was that called? So we got the sacrum, you got the sacral canal, and then at the bottom there was a little hole. Sacral hiatus. Okay, it comes out the sacral hiatus and blends in to the ligament that attaches the coccyx to the sacrum. Blends into the coccygeal ligament. Okay. So by doing that, it anchors the spinal cord straight up and down within that vertebral canal. Okay. Then, to help it out, it has what are called denticulate ligaments that come off the sides of it and anchor it to the different vertebrae, so that it's in the center of that vertebral canal and isn't moving around and banging into things. Because if those cell bodies are that important, that if we damage them, it stops functioning, we don't want anything, any way, shape, or form to hurt that if we can help it. Okay? So we got to understand what I'm saying there with those. Here's a picture, a cross section. Here's a vertebrae, get you kind of oriented. This is the front up here. This is the cell body, or excuse me, the vertebral body, centrum. Here's that vertebral canal. Here's the spinal cord that would be coming out of the screen at you. Okay. Here's the spinal nerve coming off to the left and the right, 31 pairs. Here's this denticulate ligament that comes over here and anchors itself to the side. Anchors itself to the side so that this thing can't move around. Here's some more denticulate ligaments. It comes off the pia mater and then anchors it within this canal, trying to keep it from moving. We don't want to bang it around. Other things we can see, here's what's called the epidural space. They're trying to, this yellow is supposed to look like adipose tissue. Okay. Between the bone, epidural space, then we get to the dura mater, which only had one layer, the meningeal layer. Then under that, this black right here, this is the subdural space. Then we have the arachnoid matter, the subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space is generally where you find the, not generally, it's where you find the cerebral spinal fluid. And then this layer right here, adhering to the spinal cord, would be our pia mater. Okay. So that's kind of all the layers from outside in. You guys see that? All right. The accessory structures of the meninges in the spinal cord come from what layer then? Not the dura, the pia. And the thing is, when we get to the next unit, the accessory structures in the brain from the meninges will come from the dura. Okay. The nervous system is just so frickin' involved that there's just too much. We have to break it up into 2 units. And so sometimes it's advantageous to have not as much information, and sometimes you can't connect all the dots just yet. So here, we're going to look at a spinal nerve. So this is spinal cord. And then off the spinal cord, we're going to have what are called ventral and dorsal roots. If we go back to this picture here, we have dorsal root and a ventral root. They're going to come together to make the spinal nerve. Okay? This would be the spinal nerve coming off. Ventral root, dorsal root. Okay? Dorsal root is sensory, ventral root is motor. Okay? So the signals going through the spinal nerve can be sensory or motor. When they come in, they go here, and when they go out, they come from there. Okay? So we got a dorsal root, ventral root come together, make our spinal nerve. Okay? Now, our spinal nerve, notice how they're pulling the different things out. Kind of looks like that picture we had of muscle. All right? So here we have a single neuron. We're going to take a bundle of these neurons, wrap them up together, and that's going to give us a fascicle of neurons. Does that sound familiar? we're going to take fascicles of neurons, bundle them up, put them together, and that's going to be our spinal nerve. All right? So it's the same setup. All right? Good. So a nerve is a bundle of axons. What did we call the connective tissue that went around a single muscle fiber? Endomysium. Okay? So, if your life depended on it, and I said, well, what do you think the connective tissue that's going to wrap around a single neuron is going to be called? You try to make something out of nerve, wouldn't you? Endoneurium? That sound good? All right, might sound weird. But your life depended on it, so you went with it, all right? I'm petitioning them to give me like a cattle prod so that I can ask you guys questions, and if you get it wrong, I get to zap you. Now you're thinking, that wouldn't be fun to be zapped, but you'd love coming to class watching, oh my God, we're going to get somebody zapped today. You'd all get your phones out like, oh my God, they doesn't know. Ask him, he doesn't know. All right? Some of you might even study this shit before you came in. It'd be kind of cool, wouldn't it? I think it'd be fun. Be one of those teachers thinking out of the box type of things. I could be on like shows talking about it. All right. Or in prison. You know, it might go that way too. They'll be like, how many students actually take your class? Well, nobody. Just theoretically. It worked really well one semester and then everybody left. Or, I guess you'd look at it, you could manipulate numbers. You'd be like, you know what, I only had 4 students finish, but they all did really well. So if we got the so we got the endoneurium. If we bundle those neurons up, put them in a fascicle, wrap it with connective tissue, we'll probably call it the perineurium. If we take the fascicles together, bundle those up, call them a spinal nerve, wrap it with connective tissue, we'll call that the epineurium. So it's the same prefixes you guys learned. Instead of mesium, you're going to go neurium. Okay. Doing okay? All right. So here's a picture. We mentioned what a ganglion was. Ganglia just means plural. And ganglia were where we had a cluster of neuron cell bodies, right? And because that's where the cell body is, and because often that's the multipolar neurons, then there's lots of dendrites. And we said dendrites and the cell body are often where synapses take place. A lot of times ganglions are good places for synapses, not always, but a lot of times. So cluster of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, considered to be a ganglia. We have what's called the dorsal root ganglia. We have one on each side at every spinal level. So we have 31 pairs of these dorsal root ganglia. Okay, so you have to picture what I just showed you a second ago. We had a dorsal root and a ventral root, and they came together to make the spinal nerve, right? At the spinal level, the dorsal root will always go through this area known as the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, and in there we will have some cell bodies of some of these sensory neurons. There is no synapse really taking place there. They just happen to be clusters. So they fall outside of what I just told you, but they're a common one that we have everywhere. Dorsal root ganglions are all sensory cell bodies. They're all located in there. However, fibers pass right through. There's no synapsing taking place. Okay. So here, dorsal root, ventral root, here's this dorsal root ganglion. It's kind of an enlarged area because the cell bodies are a little bit bigger, so they take up more space. Oh, well, could have went forward too. So here's our cross section of the spinal cord once again. We have, this is the dorsal, this is the anterior, okay? Anterior, dorsal for animals that walk on 4 legs, dorsal is usually their back. So this is the dorsal root, ventral root, ventral root. Ventral is motor, dorsal is sensory, Ventral is efferent. Dorsal is afferent. Okay. Dorsal root leads into the dorsal root ganglia. They come together, and we have a spinal nerve. Okay. That spinal nerve is what comes on out of the intervertebral foramen. And oftentimes that's where you might get a portion of the disc pinching on the nerve, or arthritis from bone formation pinching on the nerve and giving you problems. The central area is gray matter, surrounded by what we can see as lighter colored, is called white matter. Okay. White matter is matter that has myelination. It has those in the peripheral nervous system. It would have Schwann cells. In the central nervous system, it has what are called oligodendrocytes, and they myelinate the sheaths. They wrap themselves in little marshmallows we saw around the axon, and their function is to speed up conduction. So white matter are conducting neurons. Okay, this area here, these signals are going up and down the spinal cord. Gray matter is unmyelinated, which means they're slower. They're more for processing information, integrating information, okay? So gray matter, the neuron cell bodies have little myelin. White matter, myelinated axons. Other things you may have heard of before. So if this is the dorsal root, it came off of this portion of gray matter known as the dorsal horn. So the dorsal horn led to the dorsal root. Back here, the ventral root came from the ventral horn. There's also a little bit of what's referred to as a lateral horn here. In the center, this is called the central canal. And so we have cerebral spinal fluid that flows right down the center of the spinal cord, as well as washes all around it here. Okay. Here's actually a microscope slide of it. So what's this thing right here? Would your guess be? Yeah, the dorsal root ganglia. Good. So this would be the dorsal root. This would be the dorsal horn. This would be the ventral horn. This would be the ventral root. Central canal. Gray matter, white matter. Okay. And if we really wanted to try to get fancy, we could probably figure out meningeal layer of the dura, arachnoid matter of the dura, and the P is adhering to it that we can't really lift off of there and see on its own. All right, so spinal nerves. We said there's 31 pairs. Did we decide that these carried sensory, motor, or both? Both. Okay, good. So spinal nerves are considered to be mixed nerves. They carry both sensory and motor information. You guys already know they come out the little holes between the vertebrae that we know are called intervertebral foramen. We saw the dorsal root come together with the ventral root to make the spinal nerve. As soon as it makes the spinal nerve, it has the ability to give off branches. Okay? The proximal branches are the branches prior to making the spinal nerve. The distal branches are the ones after we've made the spinal nerve and they come off. Okay? So the proximal branches, what were the branches prior to the spinal nerve? They came together to actually make the spinal nerve. They were the roots, right? The dorsal root and the ventral root. Okay, dorsal root, sensory input to the spinal cord. Ventral root, motor output from the spinal cord. And it was these two roots that came together to make the spinal cord. Distal branches, we haven't seen yet or haven't talked about. We're going to have a dorsal ramus. Now, we said dorsal kind of refers to what? The back. Good. So, imagine we had a person laying here prone on a table. We can see their spinous processes, so we know the spinal cord and all that's towards their back. And we're talking about a branch that goes to the back. What is it going to be innervating? If we're going to have a dorsal ramus, a branch coming off of that spinal nerve and going back, What's back there? Muscle. Muscle right around the spinal cord, right? And that would be motor. It would do the muscles of your like erector spinae group. And then sensory information would be maybe just the skin back there as well, right? Because there's nothing else back there. Think of your back. Think of this branch coming out and it going backwards. There's not really that far. It's maybe that difference in height between where it's coming out into your actual back where somebody would put their hand. So they can innervate those muscles running up and down the spinal cord, or up and down the vertebrae, better answer, and the skin around there, okay? So it's going to innervate the postural muscles and the dorsal skin. The ventral ramus, ventral means it's kind of coming around front. In the thoracic area, it's going to follow the ribs around to the front, and it might do any muscles in and around there going that direction, and the skin in that area. If it was a ventral ramus and it was in the cervical or the lumbar, it might go down your extremities and do the same thing with either muscles in that area or innervation, some receptors for input from the outer world there as well. Okay? So here's best I can do on a picture for this. We got our cross section again. Here's our vertebral body. So they're laying on their stomach. Spinous process is here. We had our dorsal root, ventral root come together, dorsal root, ganglion, spinal nerve. Here we give off the dorsal ramus. It's going backwards. What's back here? Well, there's the skin and the postural muscles, rector spinae group. Okay? The ventral ramus is going to here, so dorsal ramus went back this way. It's a smaller picture. Hopefully you can kind of see it. The ventral is going to follow along, in this case, around the ribs and do something in the front of the body. Okay? Which leads us to a nerve plexus. Nerve plexuses are from these ventral rami branching and merging and connecting all throughout, generally in the cervical area and in the lumbar area. Think of it as like a highway system, okay? Probably like something outside of Los Angeles, where you got roads branching, merging, ramps getting off and on different areas. That's what these plexuses are like, okay? We have a cervical. Now, a textbook tells us we have, 5 plexuses. In the real world, you really have 2 that you deal with. Okay? The cervical plexus are all the ventral rami, all the nerves coming off from C1 to C5. Okay, so think of where that's at. C1 to C5. Then we have the brachial plexus. Brachium means what? Upper arm? Means arm. So then C5 to T1, that's going to control basically your upper arm. All right, so the textbook divides these up into 2 different ones, the cervical plexus and the brachial plexus. Any of you that work in medical coding or work anywhere, cervical brachial gets lumped together. It's basically the nerves of the neck. Okay? You have a lumbar plexus, L1 to L4, and they split it up from the sacral plexus, L4 to S4. Once again, in the real world, this gets coded and talked about, lumped together as the lumbosacral plexus. Okay? So, like I said, for us, we've got another one coming. There's 5, but in the real world, you're going to have the cervical brachial plexus, which you know is innervating your neck and upper arm, or your lumbosacral plexus, which is doing your legs and your knotty bits. And then they throw the coccygeal plexus on there. The sacrum has 4 little bones that fuse together to make it, or excuse me, the coccyx does, and nobody gives a damn about it. Okay. Now, here's a picture of the cervical plexus. All right. So, here up in the neck, here's the cervical plexus. Here below it's the brachial plexus. And it's all these nerves that are matching up, pairing off, coming together, forming a different branch, then splitting apart that innervates our whole upper extremity. And they have dissected them, and they're pretty common for everybody to have the exact same ones. One thing with nerves and arteries, we all are pretty much put together the same. Veins, they have lots of what are called anomalies. Everybody's a little different. We all get the blood returned back to the heart from every place in the body, but the branches and how it's done can always be different, person to person. Nerves, arteries, not so much. So if you were to go on to med school, that type of thing, oftentimes you'll learn all this stuff that you'll never use again. Okay? So that's kind of what a plexus looks like. Okay? And if you're a neurologist, you know where all these nerves go from C1 to the body, or C5. Where does it go? Okay? When they do neurological testing, they test strength. They test the motor portion of, say, the C5 nerve root. They know that it innervates the deltoid muscle, and they check your deltoid to see if it's strong versus the other side. Or the area, maybe it's called dermatomes, areas in the skin for sensation, and they'll rub something there, touch you there, and see if you can feel it, or does that feel numb? Can you pick up that sensation and see if there's any damage? And that they can do all this testing because they know where all these go or where all they came from. And they can tell there seems to be a problem here at C4 or C5. We're going to order an MRI to look at it. Because generally you have to have some sort of supportive documentation to have an MRI done because it's fairly expensive. The insurance companies don't want to pay for it. Okay? So they do this to narrow it down and see, okay, yeah, we need to probably look into this. And then they find a disc bulge there, and then they recommend whatever treatment they're going to do. Okay? That makes sense? We follow along? Trying to make it seem somewhat relevant to real world so you don't fall asleep. So neuroglial cells are not neurons. So the first thing I want you to know, neuroglial cells are not neurons. Neurons conduct information. Neuroglial cells do no conduction at all, ever. Okay? There's several types of neuroglial cells in the peripheral nervous system. There's only two, so it's kind of light right now. One is the Schwann cell. We said the Schwann cell makes up the what? Myelin sheath, and the myelin sheath helps with speed of conduction, right? Good. Okay. Another name for Schwann cell is a neurolemmacyte. Once again, some books use that. It's more of a descriptive name. And they myelinate the nerve fibers in the peripheral nervous system. They also have the ability to form what's called the neurolemma. The neurolemma is necessary for a neuron to repair itself. It's basically the Schwann cell brain. These Schwann cells wrap themselves around the neuron. They look like the little marshmallows. They do it in such a way, it's like a tube of toothpaste. You take the bottom of the toothpaste thing and you wrap it around this neuron, which would force all the toothpaste, all the cell cytoplasm and a nucleus that was in that tube to go to the top of it, right? So that by doing that, it forces all this stuff on the top. That's the neurolemma. The nucleus, the cell cytoplasm will be all on that top portion. And if we have this neurolemma, at least one of these Schwann cells intact, we can repair that neuron. Now, we don't have Schwann cells in the central nervous system. So if I have some sort of injury, carpal tunnel, pinched nerve, and I damage a neuron, I can, if I remove that problem, that neuron can regenerate itself. It can heal. Okay? But we all know if I have a spinal cord injury and I damage those neurons, are they going to be able to heal? No. Once you're paralyzed, you're paralyzed. Okay? They're trying to grow new neurons. That's kind of where they're going with the science of it all, from stem cells and whatnot, but they haven't been able to quite do it yet. Okay? So Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system speed up conduction and they're important for neuron regeneration. There's also what are called satellite cells. Satellite cells are thought to regulate the internal environment. They're not 100% sure what they do. They think they have the ability to reabsorb excess neurotransmitters, okay? But they don't conduct. They kind of just hold things together, and there is some evidence that they absorb the neurotransmitters if there's too much neurotransmitter released. Okay. Let's see. Quiz. Okay, so we don't have a quiz.